I was gonna film this in New York, but I forgot. Give me a sec. Do I look tough? Do I look like Kodak? What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another video. In case this isn't a welcome back, let me introduce myself. My name's Chris. I know how to read. Allegedly. Today we're going to be talking about the books that I read in January. In previous videos, I've talked about how I wasn't sure if I wanted to do reading wrap-ups anymore, but I think part of that was because I didn't feel like I was reading enough, whatever enough was, to kind of justify an entire video. But new year, same me, but I'm reading a little bit more, and I finished January and I was like, man, I actually read some books and there's like an actual discussion to be had. So I was thinking we could talk about kind of what I read in January in the comments down below. Y'all can talk about what you read in January as well. And then hopefully, even if I don't do this monthly, we can have a little discussion on kind of like what everybody's reading so far to start out the new year. We're gonna be going from worst to best, and I actually have two books that I rated 2 out of 5 stars, but I also DNF them, so are they really 2 out of 5 stars? Who's to say? It's me, I'm to say, they're 2 stars. If you've been fans of this channel for a while, you would know that I've been reading these books for 2 or 3 months, or at least attempting to, and those 2 books are The Anatomy of Violence, The Biological Roots of Crime by Adrian Rain, as well as Basketball, A Love Story by Jackie McMullen, Rafe Bartholomew, and Dan Flores. Both of these books I've been trying to read for a long time, but for separate reasons, I just can't get myself to finish them. The Anatomy of Violence is right up my alley. It is nonfiction, it is scientific, it is study-based, and even you could tell, like, I was trying to highlight and kind of force myself to like very intently read this book, but I don't know what page I got to, I just couldn't finish it. It felt like the author was just kind of going over and over, like reiterating the same points. And I guess when you're writing a whole book about the anatomy of violence, that's just something you kind of have to do. But it was pretty boring for me, to just like put it bluntly. And while I appreciate the author's writing, there are some like WTF points in this book that had me like, whatever that means. Like when you're writing a book called The Anatomy of Violence, right? And on page 43 out of like 300 and change pages, you say the gene versus environment battle comes out to a tie. I don't know if you could tell, I put duh right there. And then for me as a reader to be like, is he gonna reiterate that point for the next 300 pages? Like, I'm just not gonna read it. I'm still giving it 2 stars though, because there was like some really interesting information in here, and I feel like a part of me is going to come back to this at some point. I'm probably not gonna like donate this book just because I think I might come back to it, but I'll give it a few months and see if I ever do want to come back. But as of right now, I'm giving it 2 stars, but I did DNF it. A very sad 2 stars, a very sad DNF for Basketball, A Love Story. I'm a hoop head, I love basketball. So for me to not enjoy this book was really surprising. I've talked about it in previous videos, but this is essentially a novelization of a documentary series that was on ESPN a few years ago. And I made it to page 197 out of 416, and I could not just bring myself to finish it. Typically, each chapter starts out with a topic or a person or a period of time in the history of basketball, and then you have like quotes and interviews from people that just talk about that time or that subject or whatever. After chapters of reading kind of that style of writing, it just tended to get really repetitive and really boring, even if like the base stories that were being told in the chapter were really interesting. I also felt like in some weird way this book didn't really have to be made. Like I understand like there's some novelizations of movies and things like that that are made to just like appeal to a wider audience, but to have a book that is based on a visual sport like basketball and then you make it into a documentary, why do you also need to make it into a book, you know? So I think like people who are interested in either this book or in basketball like as a sport and its history, just watch the documentary. You know, I don't understand why this book was made. This book feels like I mean I only got to 197, but this is like 400 pages of reading a newspaper. And as someone who loves basketball, like it shouldn't feel that way. Like I really wanted to like this book, but unfortunately I did not. So I am going to DNF this. I don't see myself coming back to this anytime soon. So I might end up donating this, but there were some stories in here. There were some like periods of time that were really interesting. I just didn't like the medium and the format. So I am giving this 2 stars, even though it is a DNF and I barely got maybe 45% of the way through. So sad DNF, but we gotta do what we gotta do. Now let's get to the books that I actually finished to start off January. I've been on an audiobook kick recently, and by kick, I mean like I've been listening to at least one. I've been using both Spotify and Libby for my audiobooks, and we'll get to the Libby one soon, but the audiobook that I listened to on Spotify to start out this month was The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. This was and still is a very popular book. I don't remember if it was on the Times 100 like most notable books of the year list, but I remember hearing a lot about it from the New York Times. This book discusses how the introduction of what Haidt calls a phone-based childhood, but really just like an internet-based childhood, has led to like a major drop-off in children and young adult mental health. And only like a few hours into this audiobook, I felt like in a weird way, like I usually don't focus on titles that much, but I felt like the title of this book was kind of off. I felt like while anxiety is obviously a part of what this book is about, it is nowhere near like encompassing as to everything that Jonathan Haidt is able to discuss in this book. Maybe it's like a clickbait book title, you know, calling it The Anxious Generation makes more people read it, but I feel like there could have been a title that could have been workshopped. I don't know what it is. If y'all have read this book and you have like a different title, or you even disagree with me on this point, leave a comment down below, but I felt like there could have been a title that does a better job of encompassing what this book is about, instead of having like that really long subtitle on the cover of the book. I feel like one of the things Jonathan Haidt handled really well is discussing both sides of the equation, right? So they have a bunch of points that, or a bunch of ideas that they want to implement into schools, into like the average child's life, to make them better accustomed to having the internet at their fingertips, right? So it's not like interrupting their school time, it's not interrupting time with family and friends, more just using it as a tool instead of like an extension of us. And I feel like handling that both from the perspective of someone who's like, we need to do this to change, like this is how it's affecting our children, this is how we need to do better for our children and our grandchildren, and also from the aspect of like, raising kids is hard, teaching students is hard, and sometimes having a cell phone or an iPad or a computer or whatever can make that easier. I feel like Haidt does a good job of merging those two ideas into his ideas on how we can make like having all of this technology and this access to information a lot easier and a lot more like welcoming to children. Even though he talks about this not being like the main purpose of the book, a lot of The Anxious Generation is focused on like, if you the reader were to raise kids, these are some of the things that you should implement, or if you're a teacher or a like school administrator, this is how you should handle technology in schools. Haidt goes on to say that that isn't the main purpose of this book, but it really, like, as I was listening to it, it really got me to think about how I interacted with technology as a kid and how I would interact with technology if I had children of my own. And so it kind of like really got me thinking about how we as a society really predispose, like not even our children, I was going to say, but like family members, like younger cousins, just younger people in general, how we interact with technology influences them so heavily with how they interact with technology. I will say one of the things I didn't like about this audiobook was the audiobook narrator. The introduction of the book is actually narrated by Jonathan Haidt, and I think he had like some cold or some sort of throat sickness to where he couldn't narrate the rest of the book. So that was kind of weird, and it's honestly the first time that I haven't really vibed with an audiobook narrator. I don't know if that's something that y'all deal with on a regular basis. So that kind of made it a little hard to listen to, but I still feel like Jonathan Haidt's writing kind of really shines through, like even if I don't like the narrator at all. And also once you get towards the end of the book where Haidt talks about like the applications of his ideals and his ideology, I think that's the really interesting, like the meat and potatoes part of the book. So for all of those reasons, I ended up giving The Anxious Generation 4 stars. I had a chance to buy this when I was in New York, but I felt like listening to it on audiobook was like the best of both worlds. I got to read a really good book, but I probably wouldn't like spend the money to buy it. But I still very much enjoy it, and if the topic sounds anywhere near interesting to you, I highly recommend. The next book that I read, and also the first country that we're gonna scratch off on our world map in my Reading Around the World challenge, is right here, Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. Now I have read this before, but like I explained in my preparing for my Reading Around the World challenge video, I want to reread all the books. Like, I don't want to scratch off like, oh, I've read this book before, let me scratch it off already. No, I want to reread every book, and the first book that I started with was Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and I enjoyed it so much. This book right here is a very cute, pretty short book about a coffee shop in Japan that if you drink a certain type of coffee from this coffee shop, it allows you to go back in time, and you have to come back to the present before the coffee gets cold. Very simple premise, like very like light amount of magical realism. Like I said, this is a reread for me. This is the second time I'm reading this book, but one of the things I loved most about the first time I read this book and now the second time that I read this book is how well the author is able to, like, even if they're not deep dives, but is able to like flesh out this small cast of characters so well to the point where even if you don't know too much about them, you know at the very least like their vibe. Like you know what each character is about, even if like they aren't explicitly talked about all the time. The book itself is divided into 4 chapters, and one of the things that surprised me on my reread is how kind of like dry the writing is in the very beginning. And maybe dry isn't the right word for it. Maybe like simplistic or straightforward is a better way of saying it. But I remember rereading the first chapter of this book and just being like, wow, this is like very straightforward, and like I wasn't really like liking it as much as I remembered liking it. So that first chapter, which isn't even that long, it might be 40 pages give or take, was like difficult for me to get through in a way that I was not expecting. But once that second chapter hits, I forget what it's called. Let me get the name of that second chapter. I think it's The Lovers. Okay, the first chapter is called The Lovers. The second chapter is Husband and Wife. Husband and Wife goes crazy. Once I was reading through that chapter, it gave me enough like energy and like kind of like buy-in into this book to finish reading it like in a few hours at most. And I guess it just took some sort of like getting used to, because like the author's writing style is like so straightforward and matter of fact that coming from like different styles of reading of the books that I've been reading, it was kind of like a very like jarring difference. But once you got that first chapter out of the way, you're introduced to a majority of the characters and the premise, and like the style, like the writing style doesn't change obviously throughout the book. I think it just took some time for me to get like readjusted to it a second time. But once you get to like the second chapter is my favorite chapter, but once you get kind of introduced to everything and now you're like vibing with the book, if you're reading up to that point, it becomes like a lot easier to like get through, if that makes sense. I really did enjoy this book. I haven't read any of the sequels and I don't know what any of the sequels are about, but maybe in the future I might be interested in picking some of those up. I gave this book 4 stars and I don't regret it at all. I'll probably reread this again at some point in the future, and it's a very short read. If you'll have a chance to read this, pick it up. If any of this sounds interesting to you, like I think this is definitely like a vibe. Even if you don't or haven't read any like Japanese literature previously, I think this is a very good starting point. Very simple read, very cute. It can like tug at your heartstrings at certain points. Another book that I read in January was this heavy boy right here, Hamilton the Revolution by Lin-Manuel Miranda and Jeremy McCarter. Off rip, I'm gonna say I gave this book 3 stars, and it's lower than I thought I would give this book because I really enjoyed the act of reading this book, if that makes sense. This book is a bunch of background information on the development, the creation, the performing, and kind of the popularity afterwards of the Hamilton musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda. And this book is just chock full of beautiful photography and quotes and like annotations and footnotes of songs and things like that. And I really enjoyed doing this. I made that video showing my roommate Hamilton for the first time, and that was when I was about halfway through this book was when we filmed that video, and finishing it like gave me such like a bigger appreciation of everything that goes into making a musical like of this caliber that has stood the test of time. This premiered like 10 years ago on Broadway. So for it to still have like the cultural effect that it has now in 2025, I think is awesome. I think in one of the videos I said that reading this book felt like watching the Mona Lisa be painted. And I still think that that holds true. Like the photography in this is so beautiful. Like getting all of that behind the scenes information, to me, like as a nerd, like I loved it so much. I just feel like I'm probably never gonna read this again, if that makes sense. Like I might skip through to look at the photography because again, like some of the photos in this book are so beautiful. Like the pages are like thick frayed cardstock. Like this is like a reading experience, like in a way that like reading other books has not been an experience. But I think I got everything that I wanted to get out of this book, and I think it's beautiful. Like it's definitely like a book you display, and this like bookcase isn't really like the best place to do that. But I gave this book 3 stars, not because of the content or because of like the physical reading aspect of it, but I'm just probably not gonna pick this up again anytime soon. So, and then the first 5-star book of the year, you're somewhere in this giant stack of books right here, is Stoner by John Williams. I forgot how perfect this book is. The description of this book is so easy. You are following a man named William Stoner as he goes from being like a middle of nowhere farm boy in Missouri to going to Columbia University in Missouri to eventually becoming like a tenured professor of English literature at this college. You follow his life from like the very inklings of him wanting to become an English professor to him getting married, to him having children, to him having an affair, to him getting sick. Like, you go through this man's entire life in a way that like I don't really know of any other books that have like made me feel like I was a fly on the wall as much as I was a fly on the wall to this man's life in this book. Don't get confused. The main character of this book is William Stoner, and the author of this book is John Williams. But like, what's so crazy about this book is like John Williams' writing isn't even that crazy. Like, his prose is like very simplistic, for lack of a better word, but it's like such beautiful writing. Like, it really encapsulates everything, whether you're talking about Stoner himself or Edith, his wife, or like Archer Sloan, who's like a coworker of his at the school. You learn so much about these characters in such a straightforward and, honestly, now that I think about it, very similar to Kawaguchi's style of writing at certain points, where it's not very like flamboyant or like artistic or flowerful. It is just very basic, but it does such a great job of conveying what Williams is trying to say that it just makes this book so great so quickly. I gave this book 5 stars. Let's get that out of the way. But this book had me thinking about rearranging the top 10 list that I made towards the end of last year. William Stoner gets married in this book to a woman named Edith Bostwick. And Edith is like the perfect example of a flawed female character. Much more so than Daisy in Great Gatsby. I made a whole video on Great Gatsby, and I love Great Gatsby so much. Edith Bostwick blows Daisy Buchanan out of the water in terms of like complex, like intricate, flawed female writing. Like, she is such an interesting character in this book. Edith grows up in like a strict, like very sheltered, very taken care of upbringing by her parents, very like wealthy upbringing as well. And as you go on through the book and as she becomes a bigger part of Stoner's life, you begin to realize like how that upbringing affected her and how that upbringing affected Stoner and their eventual daughter. And John Williams doesn't go too crazy with it. He doesn't give you like the deepest dive into her lore, into her backstory, but what he does tell you is so like chock full of information, even if it's like a paragraph or two every couple of chapters. Like, the way that Williams is able to tell you about Edith's backstory, and like, Edith does some very not nice things in this book, but the way that Williams is able to not even justify it, but to provide backstory to why she is making these decisions to Stoner, and like as Stoner is realizing why she is making these decisions, is so interesting and beautiful that like it really, like, I thought Gatsby was my favorite classic. Like, it's Stoner. 5 stars. 5 stars for Stoner. I've said this before in previous videos, but I think one of the best things an author can do is really make you feel for a character, both when they're making good decisions and when they're making bad decisions. This is a sad book about a sad man, right? But I feel like the points when Stoner is making these bad decisions or decisions that you don't agree with, there were, like, I genuinely felt for him in these moments. And even though, like, I disagreed fully with the decisions he was making, the way that Williams, or John Williams to specify, was able to write about these decisions and Stoner's mindset while making them, I felt for him. And again, like, John Williams' writing in this book isn't like crazy or anything like that, but I think it's still beautiful in its own way. This is the 4th page of this book, talking about Stoner's parents. He says his mother regarded her life patiently as if it were a moment that she had to endure. Bar. While Stoner was talking to Archer Sloan, who was his teacher at college that eventually persuaded him, or like unlocked the want in Stoner to become a teacher. While talking to Stoner, Archer Sloan says, "You must remember what you are and what you have chosen to become, and the significance of what you are doing. There are wars and defeats and victories of the human race that are not military and that are not recorded in the annals of history. Remember that while you're trying to decide what to do." another bar. Later on in the book, John Williams says he was 42 years old and he could see nothing before him that he wished to enjoy and little behind him that he cared to remember. Again, not crazy like flowery writing, just very basic, very straightforward, but it's still able to pack a punch and make you feel something. 5 stars if there ever was one. I have to go through and watch my top 10 books of all time video because I got to throw Stoner in there and something's got to be bumped out because this book is the definition of a perfect classic for me. And those are all the books that I read in January. I'm looking right here. We have 3 physical books, 1 audio book, and 2 books that I ended up DNFing. I want to thank y'all for watching this video. Like I said earlier, I wasn't sure if I was going to be doing reading wrap-ups anymore, but one of the things I want to do for this channel is kind of add like a realistic, like this is how much a regular person reads when they can. So even if I don't read too much, I might try to go back to a reading wrap-up every 1 or 2 months. I want to hear what y'all have read to start off the year, so make sure you leave a comment down below on what you're reading right now. Loved it or hated it, I want to know. If you like this video or any of the other videos I'm putting out, I think my last video was so much fun going to New York and buying a ton of books. If you haven't seen that, something should be popping up. I highly recommend you watch it. And if you like that video or this video or any of the other videos that I've been putting out, please make sure to subscribe. We just passed 200 subscribers. Thank you so much. I appreciate all the love and support that y'all are giving me, that y'all have given me, and that y'all will continue to give me in the future. Let's make sure that 2025 is a year of great reading and a bunch of great videos from your boy to you. I want to thank y'all for watching, and I'll catch y'all next time. Peace.